Today, the cucumber is almost invisible. It sits quietly in salads, sandwiches, and jars of pickles. Millions of people eat it every day without ever wondering where it came from. But thousands of years ago, the cucumber looked very different. It was smaller, more bitter, full of seeds, and nowhere near as pleasant to eat as the crisp green vegetable we know today. So, how did a bitter little wild plant become one of the most familiar vegetables on Earth? The answer is not a single invention. There was no ancient farmer who suddenly created the modern cucumber. Instead, it was a process that unfolded over thousands of years. Across the villages of South Asia, along ancient trade routes, through Central Asia and China, across the Middle East and Europe, and eventually across the Atlantic. Generation after generation, humans kept choosing the fruits they liked best. And without knowing anything about genes or DNA, they slowly changed the plant. They made it bigger, less bitter, more productive, more useful. The cucumber we know today is the result of that enormous experiment. An experiment that began thousands of years ago with a small, bitter fruit growing somewhere in South Asia.
The cucumber belongs to the species Cucumis sativus. One of the closest living relatives of the cultivated cucumber is commonly associated with the wild form known as Cucumis sativus var. Hardwicki, which still occurs in parts of India. Compared with modern cultivated cucumbers, these wild forms are generally much smaller and more variable. And there was another problem. They could be bitter. Very bitter. But bitterness was not necessarily a deal breaker for early humans. Because humans have a remarkable habit. When we find a plant with useful qualities, we don't just eat it. We save it. We plant it. And then we do it again. And again. And again. The first transformation. Around 3,000 years ago, people in the Indian subcontinent began selecting cucumbers in ways that would slowly change the plant forever. They did not understand genes. They did not know about DNA. They had never heard of plant breeding, but they understood something much more practical. Some fruits were better than others. Perhaps one plant produced larger fruits. Another had less bitterness. Another had more flesh. Another produced fruits that were easier to eat or preserve. So people naturally saved seeds from the plants they preferred. Those seeds were planted the following season. Then the best plants were selected again. Generation after generation, this simple process changed the cucumber. The fruits became larger. The bitterness was reduced. The amount of edible flesh increased, and the plant became increasingly suited to human needs. This was domestication. And it was not a single event. It was a long partnership between humans and plants, repeated over hundreds of generations. But the cucumber's journey was only beginning. At some point, cultivated cucumbers began moving beyond their original centers of cultivation. They traveled with people, with farmers, with traders, and along the ancient routes connecting South Asia with Central Asia and China. The exact path was probably not a single road. Instead, imagine a chain of human settlements and trading networks, from the Indian subcontinent, through regions around the Himalayas, toward northwestern India and Afghanistan, into Central Asia, and eventually eastward toward China. As cucumbers moved into new environments, humans continued to select them, and this produced something fascinating. The cucumber populations in East Asia gradually became genetically distinct from those associated with the Indian lineage.
Genetic studies suggest that major East Asian cucumber lineages had already begun diverging from Indian lineages roughly 2,500 years ago. And this is where history gives us a famous name, Zhang Qian.
During the 2nd century BC, the Han Dynasty sent the explorer and envoy Zhang Qian westward. He traveled into Central Asia, visiting regions far beyond the Chinese heartland. Later historical tradition associated Zhang Qian with the introduction of several crops and agricultural products into China. The cucumber is sometimes included in this story. It is an attractive story. A Chinese envoy travels west. He encounters unfamiliar plants. He returns home, and one of those plants becomes the cucumber. But there is an important distinction.
We should not say that Zhang Qian personally brought cucumber seeds back to China as an established historical fact.
A new life in China. The people who cultivated cucumbers in China did not simply preserve the plant exactly as they had received it. They continued selecting it, and China presented a completely different agricultural challenge. The country stretched across enormous climatic zones. There were hot and humid regions in the south. There were cooler regions farther north. Different soils, different growing seasons, different culinary traditions. So farmers selected plants that performed well under their local conditions. A plant that tolerated heat could be favored in warmer regions. Plants that performed better under cooler conditions could be selected elsewhere. Some fruits were chosen for fresh eating. Others were selected because they were crisp. Some were better suited to preservation and pickling. Over many generations, East Asian cucumbers became an extraordinarily diverse group. And eventually, some varieties developed the long, slender shapes that are now strongly associated with Chinese and other East Asian cucumbers. The cucumber was no longer simply a crop that had traveled from one region to another. It was becoming a collection of local crops, shaped by different cultures.
The story continued across East Asia. Cucumbers spread into Korea, Japan, and neighboring regions. And once again, local farmers began selecting their own preferred plants. This is why a cucumber grown in Japan does not necessarily look or taste like one grown in China, and neither is exactly the same as a traditional Korean variety. The same basic plant had entered different cultures, and each culture had begun writing its own chapter into the cucumber's genetic history. But the journey was about to become even larger. By the early medieval period, cucumbers were established far beyond South and East Asia. Sources from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East indicate that cucumbers were known in regions corresponding roughly to parts of modern-day Iran, Iraq, and Turkey. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Arabic agricultural, medical, and culinary writings described cucumbers under names such as khiyar. And something important had changed. The cucumber was no longer simply an unfamiliar agricultural plant. It had become part of everyday food culture. Cucumbers appeared in medical and pharmacological writings. They appeared in recipes. They could be eaten fresh, used in cold dishes, preserved and pickled. Some culinary traditions even developed ways of preserving them for use beyond the growing season. In other words, the cucumber had become more than a crop. It had become an ingredient. And from the Middle East, its story continued westward.
As cucumbers spread into Europe, European farmers and gardeners began selecting them for their own climates and tastes. And two broad preferences became increasingly important: fresh eating and preservation. For fresh eating, people wanted cucumbers that were crisp, juicy, and relatively mild. For pickling, smaller and firmer fruits were often more desirable. Over time, this helped create the enormous diversity of cucumbers we recognize today. The cucumber on a salad, the cucumber in a sandwich, the cucumber floating in a jar of pickles. They may look like different foods,
but they are descendants of the same ancient agricultural story.
Eventually, Europeans carried cucumbers across the Atlantic during the period of European expansion and colonization of the Americas. Once again, the plant entered new environments, and once again, people selected it. Farmers chose varieties that performed well under local growing conditions. They selected fruits for fresh eating, preservation, and different culinary uses. The cucumber was now growing on another continent. Its journey had crossed thousands of kilometers and thousands of years. But humans were about to gain a new tool that would accelerate its transformation.
During the 19th and 20th centuries, plant breeding became increasingly systematic. Farmers and professional breeders could deliberately cross plants with desirable characteristics. They could select for fruit size, shape, color, texture, yield, disease resistance, and suitability for different climates. Then genetics transformed plant breeding even further. What had once taken generations of observation and selection could increasingly be studied at the level of heredity. And the humble cucumber became remarkably diverse. Long cucumbers, short cucumbers, smooth cucumbers, spiny cucumbers, fresh-eating varieties, pickling varieties, green cucumbers in dozens of shades and shapes. Yet, despite all these differences, their story still leads back to the same place. A wild plant growing among other vegetation in South Asia. A small, bitter fruit, and humans who looked at that plant and thought, perhaps we can make this better.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more awesome videos.